Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're in the UK, and welcome for those who are viewing from around the world. Thank you very much to Mark for inviting me to do this talk. The 8 weeks so far have flown by, and I have to say I'm looking forward to the future talks as well. For those of you who aren't aware, the talk is on an aeroplane called the Fairey Barracuda, an extinct aircraft design, initially envisaged just before the Second World War, and then fairly rapidly rushed in production over a 3-year period, leading to an aircraft that, funnily enough, lasted for over 10 years in service with the Fleet Air Arm, but had a very mixed history and reputation in terms of how air crews viewed it. The aircraft was found during the initial survey work in preparation for the IFA2 interconnector route, a project between the National Grid and French electricity delivery companies to move electricity across the channel to the UK, and where the interconnector comes ashore in the Solent, just off Daedalus, the aircraft was discovered during the geophysical surveys. Because it's an aircraft, it's covered under the Protection of Military Remains Act, and therefore in order to do any work with it, a license had to be acquired. The first stage in that process was identifying the aircraft, and in looking at the documentary record, it was initially identified as one type. However, when the video footage was analysed, a different type of aircraft was identified, but we'll come on to that in a minute. So to give you an idea of its location, as you can see, the site is approximately 500 metres off the end of what was the former Royal Navy Air Station Lyon Solent, known as Daedalus, which was also the headquarters for the Air Command for the Fleet Air Arm, and previous to that was operated as a Royal Air Force Navy station. The little image on the corner shows you the route of the cable. The site location actually is where the 6 interconnector cables come together and come ashore, and therefore it presented a major problem in terms of what could be done. Excuse me, sorry about that. Slides jumping forward. 2 options were looked at. The first option was to remove the aircraft, which was the cheapest option. The second option, which was seriously considered, was that if there had been fatalities with the aircraft, and it was therefore protected, as I said before, under the Protection of Military Remains Act, that the cable route would have to be completely rerouted at rather large cost. So the first option was the preferred one, and fortunately, following the research and investigation into the aircraft, it was realised that there were no casualties at the time of the crash. Funny picture turned up this week in looking through the archives. What you can see in the top sort of center, slightly to the left of the image, is a little white spot, approximately 500 meters off the airfield at Daedalus. However, as far as we know, this is not the remains of the aircraft protruding from the water in 1946 when the picture was taken. Daedalus was used extensively for both weapons training for aircrews and also for weapons trials, and it was also used as an aerodrome dummy deck landing field. So this is where they would set up the appearance of an aircraft carrier on the runway, and flight crews would do what are now known as bumps and circuits and practice takeoff and landings from the restricted space that they would have on an aircraft carrier deck before they were deployed to the Far East, in many cases for the air crews who trained at Daedalus, but also on the convoy duties. So, as I said before, the wreck site was approximately 500 meters off the beach, close to the end of the runway at Daedalus. The nose of the aircraft was pointing roughly southeast, and during the initial survey, we discovered it was canted over to port. On further investigation, it was realized that what had occurred is on takeoff, the design of the Barracuda and its hydraulic systems were such that the starboard wheel would come up first, and then the port wheel would come up second. And what we have is a classic example of one wheel retracted and one wheel sticking out into the seabed, this leading to the aircraft being canted over onto its starboard wing. It lay flush to the seabed in parts and partially exposed in others. So the engine, as you can see from the image, was approximately ½ a metre out of the seabed. The seabed in this part of the Solent comprises a hard clay layer and then covered with very loose sediment, which is very dynamic. So during the excavation phase, we'd find the divers would excavate the trenches overnight, and when we get back in the morning, the trenches would be refilled with soft sediment, slowing the project down significantly. The red line in the corner is a scale for 5 meters, and as you can see from the image, you're looking approximately north with the engine in the front, the very damaged starboard wing right in front of you, and then the more complete port wing to the right of the image. The little triangle with the white spots on it is actually one of our photogrammetry targets in order to help us stitch the images together on the computer once they've been taken. During the recording phase of the project, out of the 38 dives we did, there were less than 5 dives that were suitable for taking photography on the site due to the sediment all over the site and the flushing of the tide. For those of you who are not aware, the Solent has a double tidal system, and therefore it has some very interesting eddy currents and directional flow through the day. So the origins of the Barracuda. Its origins can be traced back to a specification laid down by the British Air Ministry in 1937 in order to replace the Fairey Swordfish, which was a torpedo bomber reconnaissance aircraft, most well known for the attack on the Bismarck, where it damaged the Bismarck's rudder and helped lead to its destruction. The aircraft was actually brought in very, very rapidly. The first prototype was flying by 1940, and it was operational by 1943. This all sounds very simple in itself, but what the design of the aircraft was, it was the first all-metal fuselaged aircraft developed for the Fleet Air Arm. It was a high-wing cantilever monoplane, whereas previously they'd operated biplanes. It had a retractable undercarriage, and as you look at the pictures on the different designs, it's very peculiar undercarriage. It's designed like that solely for the purpose of the wings to fold. It had an unfortunate start in that its engines, which were originally designed by Rolls-Royce, was cancelled, and therefore it had to make do with a single supercharged version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, most famously remembered on Lancasters and Spitfires. However, this is the lower rated version, and it was quickly realised after the first type that it had to be uprated, and it went through 2 upgrades before in the final version, the Mark V version, it had a completely different Rolls-Royce engine fitted. The specifications as the aircraft went through its development kept changing, and so what was very quickly realized was that the aircraft was actually underpowered for its weight, and this was always an issue through the entire life of the aircraft. However, in terms of crew comfort and an observation and from the aircraft, it was very, very popular with its air crews. Once people got used to the fact that it was quite a low-powered aircraft, it actually won a lot of admirers and followers. Sorry, my slides seem to be jumping forward. So having identified the aircraft type, we therefore had to go back and look and see what we could find. As I intimated at the start, we started off with the documentary records looking at the local historic environment records. And these listed only 1 aircraft lost off Daedalus, which was a Mark V Barracuda lost in 1948. However, the video, which we shared with the Fleet Air Arm Museum down at Yeovilton through a happy circumstance while I was researching another piece of the debris we'd recovered, the RATOG units, which I shall talk about towards the end. In a conversation with Will Gibbs, who is their conservation engineer, we realized that it probably was an earlier model Barracuda. And having sent the images back, they came back to us very quickly with a series of shots showing where they're rebuilding one and linking it up to the video footage that we supplied, so identifying it as a Mark II. However, we had no evidence at this point of a Mark II lost in close proximity to Lyon Solent. So a little bit of further research, and we identified two potential aircraft. BV739, which was a Blackburn-built Fairey Barracuda Mark II, lost on the 29th of September 1943, and LS473, a Fairey-built Mark II, lost on the 6th of January 1944. So as you can see, in very close proximity. The records for the area with the further research, there's at least another 4 Barracudas lost within about 20 kilometers of this site. So unlikely to be confused. But what we discovered, and as I'll explain as we go through the slides later on in terms of identifying it, we've discovered that what the documentary records show and what the actual archaeological evidence show can be two separate things on occasion. The picture in this image is taken from the Imperial War Museum, and what is very nice about it, it shows some of the things we recovered. So as you can see, at the back of this image is a Youngman's flap, which were used as dive brakes during the aircraft bombing operations. Funnily enough, we didn't find the one from the port wing. However, we did find the one from the starboard wing, and as you will see from the image, it's in very good condition. Again, we also found the searchlight that's mounted on the forward end of the wing, and we found all the bomb mounts, known as bomb crutches, and we found the winding gear in order to recover the bombs up onto the wing. The design was such that in order to operate off carrier decks, you didn't need additional equipment. The aircraft had it fitted within the wings in order to jack them up or crane them up onto the wing mounts. So the recovery. The initial plan on the recovery was to hopefully recover the aircraft in its entirety in one piece. However, once we got onto the site and started investigating, and the divers started removing the sediment and material off the wing surfaces and excavating it from within the fuselage, it was realized that the starboard wing was actually separate and so could be recovered as a separate piece. And in investigating it, its degree of damage and things meant that it needed to be brought up in sections. So the first thing that occurred was that we cut the hydraulic mounts for the Youngman's flap on that side, and that was recovered as a separate piece. We then recovered the remains of that wing. The divers then cut the engine off the aircraft in order to bring that up separately as probably the single most heavy item. And then looking at the port wing and the main part of the fuselage, it was realized that these would probably be able to be lifted together. Having initially tested a lift using just strops, the decision was made to recover it in its entirety using a subsea basket. It has recovered on the deck as just lowered. To give you some positioning on it, what you're looking at is to the right of the image is the uppermost part of the aircraft. To the left is the bottom. You're actually looking side on into the observer's cockpit, which was the midsection, and then coming towards you, the straight bars are the remains of the wing struts. So the first thing recovered was the Youngman's flap. It is possibly the most complete part in terms of skin surface that we recovered in the project. The downside of it is that this object's completely full of sand, and so it has led to a lot of issues on the conservation. One in terms of getting access to it in order to flush out all the sand and material and debris in it, but also in terms of preventing the corrosion on the inner surfaces. What we discovered is a lot of the skin surface has been eroded away over time, both by the action of sea erosion, but also where there's been a lot of dredging damage on the site. The other area of damage that was quite significant was where there was manganese alloy material, constructed parts, particularly the wheel hubs, the wheels, and as these reacted with the seawater and basically fizzed off, what you got is a lot of additional damage to all of the front wing surface from this material breaking down and causing active corrosion sites on the wings. What we did find was an enormous amount of material. The aircraft was remarkably complete considering 70 years in the sea and the damage it had received. the joy of many shipwrecks, unlike terrestrial sites or aircraft crashes at sea and shipwrecks, is that they are generally operational at the time they are lost, and therefore you get them in complete at that moment in time, whereas many terrestrial sites tend to be what's left of rubbish or places that have been reused or abandoned. And so we have an operational aircraft which was fitted for an operational deployment. So within the airframe, we have found ordnance, and this was all disposed of by the explosive ordnance team that was on board the vessel throughout the operation, and who had to ensure that the site was clear of ordnance at the end of the operation in order to sign it off to move the project forward and enable the cable layers to move in after us. What you can see in the images is we managed to recover the observer's sliding cockpit section complete. This was tucked down one side of the aircraft, and this is the only complete part, or the only part really we have recovered of the actual cockpit glazing. In the center, you can see what is the tag seat, which is the telegraphist air gunner seat at the back of the aircraft, and this is the only example of one of these in existence. And they're made of aeroplastic, so quite unusual. And there's the remains of the leather backing. Below it is one of the fuel reservoirs for the engine, and as you can see on it, there's also still the pencil handwritten notes on it. And then next to that is one of the radios out of the tag cockpit. In the later versions of the aircraft, they had up to 14 radios fitted, significantly increasing the aircraft's weight. On recovery, and in discussion with the Fleet Air Arm Museum, because they had specific goals in terms of the recovered material, the aim being for reuse of the material in their reconstruction project rather than an attempt to conserve the entire aircraft as recovered, the decision was made to cut the aircraft up into sections whereby there would be the minimum amount of damage on the frames and the spar pieces and the rest of the construction. So as you can see, the left-hand picture shows the cockpit as recovered as we'd taken it to pieces. And then on the right, and we're talking less than 3-4 months later, you can see a section already cleaned, powder coated, and actually in place on the restoration project. One of the interesting things of the recovered material was we recovered a number of batteries. And one afternoon down at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, a decision was made to clean one up and see if we could get a charge out of it. And funnily enough, it did actually produce less than a voltage charge, but after 70 years immersion, they still functioned. The two smaller images are just an example of the hundreds, if not thousands, of parts that they are slowly cleaning and recovering from the remains of the aircraft. The Barracuda had over 17,000 individual components. It was produced across 4 aircraft manufacturers, from the original producers, Fairey Aviation. It was also produced by Blackburns, Westlands, and Balkan and Paul. The idea being that the parts could be interchangeable, Fairey retaining complete control over the manufacturing processes, including quality control, but the individual companies producing the aircraft for them. Sorry, I'm jumping forward again. As an example of our recovered material, and also one of the problems we had with the site, the item here is the blind flying instrument panel from the pilot's cockpit. On the left, you can see the gauges in it. One of the issues with the gauges was, of course, that they all contain radium paint. And it was decided very early on in the project that the risk, the radiological hazard was such that all these parts would have to be discarded. Therefore, as part of the processing on board the vessel, we separated all these parts off. They were all reboxed and labeled, and then they were all redeposited within the archaeological exclusion zone that exists within the project on the IFE2. The reason behind that is that one of the other major recovery that occurred during this project was a 25-meter section of wooden shipwreck, which is currently being researched, and the papers are being finished off on that in order to release that to the public. Other covered material, there were no real personal effects. What we did find was a number of flying boots, and we did find the oxygen mask from the pilot's cockpit. Interestingly, we have 2 right flying boots and 1 left flying boot. So there is a question as to whether air crews left their boots within the aircraft. If you look at Fleet Air Arm air crews, during this period, they do seem to be quite casual in terms of their dress. A lot of them seem to be almost wearing their number 2 dress or their day-to-day uniform when they fly, with perhaps the addition of a jacket or just boots. Oxygen masks, the early Barracudas were discovered to have a fault within their hydraulic systems, and the instruction, once they realized what caused the fault, the instruction went out to all air crews that the pilots should wear their oxygen masks at all times during flight. The reason being that a hydraulic pipe in the floor of the cockpit that connected to one of the gauges could develop fractures, and this would release hydraulic fluid into the cockpit, which was actually acted as an anesthetic, leading to a number of crashes until a test pilot actually had a lucky escape, passing out just as he finished landing, at which point the cause was identified and this change in the instructions to the crew was issued. You may see also from the 2 boots soles that are there that we have actually got stamped impressions on them. However, currently there appears to be no clear linkages to their origin or what design they are, the suggestion being that they might be of an escape type boot, so that the pilots were they were calf length boots, but what you could do is then cut the tops off so they looked like normal shoes, if you were in a situation where you had to carry out some form of escape. So, identifying the aircraft. As we recovered the sections, there were a number of sort of indicators that suggested that perhaps the aircraft was not the initial one we thought it was. Part of it was to do with color schemes and things, and as you'll see as we progress, you'll also see the number of plates that started to come up that suggested that actually it wasn't a Blackburn built aircraft, but it was actually built by Fairey's themselves. On recovery, the engine was very, very packed with mud, but very complete. And it is a very nice example of a Merlin 35. And what you can see is something very unique to the Fairey Barracuda is the radiator on the front edge. Four-bladed prop, as you can see, made of wood, and the classic outline of a Merlin. What it is missing is all its covers. These being aluminium have corroded away long ago, or possibly been from impact from dredging that occurs in the area, as the area is quite heavily scalloped and oyster dredged. But having moved the engine up to the Fleet Air Arm Museum, as they cleaned it off in their citric water baths that it was in, they discovered stuck to it was the engine plate. So quite lucky find, with just mud basically holding it on. The Royal Swiss Heritage Centre was approached, and the information they fed back to us appears to confirm that actually it was LS473. The engine, numbered 71231, was built in October 1943 and dispatched to Stockport, Fairey's at Stockport, on the 13th of October. And it was one of a batch of 280 that had been built at Derby under an Air Ministry order. The 281259 number that you can see on it is the Air Ministry's identification for it. Combining this information with the fact that LS473 came off the production line in 1943, and along with the other evidence that we're finding, really points to the aircraft being produced at Fairey's rather than at one of the other manufacturers. However, you'll see from the next bit, the supply chain is very variable. Other indicators that suggest that the aircraft was not the one we initially identified as and was the fact that the arrestor hook on the aircraft showed no wear or tear at all, indicating that it probably never been used or deployed in any form, or even on landing at Daedalus. and that there was a torpedo crutch and retaining cabling fragment still in place on underneath the aircraft. The first identified aircraft was not carrying torpedoes, and from everything we know about the aircraft design, what would occur is that if it was not carrying a torpedo, they would remove the retaining cable fragment. In true style, when they first initially fitted it and trialed the aircraft, they very quickly realized that when they dropped the torpedo, the loose end of the cable would smash against the underneath of the fuselage, punching holes in the thin skin. So they fixed this problem by basically using a short piece of bungee cord to retain it, and taking them on when they weren't being used for operational flying. The remains of that torpedo crutch is the image on the right there, and as you can, and I don't think I need to say the other one is the arrestor hook. So what were we finding, and what was helping confirm that possibly we'd misidentified the aircraft initially? As the plane was taken to pieces, the various manufacturing plates and tags were being recovered and cleaned up. It became clear that there were no things indicating it was coming from the Blackburn factory. So, for example, the two images we've got there, on the left is a Fairey tag, and Fairey's operated a unique hook and eye tag system, whereas Blackburn's used to use a rolled edge tag. And then next to it, you can see the stamp, and that is a Bolton and Paul stamp on it. Though less conclusive, the idea being that with Fairey's controlling the supply chain, that actually the parts were being shipped in from the different manufacturers to Fairey building this particular aircraft. When you break down the numbers of aircraft built, funnily enough, Fairey built less than Blackburn's, and this is also another factor in why we did initially think that it was a Blackburn designed aircraft. Further on, another part only recently discovered, and unfortunately with the shutdown with the coronavirus, we've not been able to go down and record this and look at it in more detail, but we also have parts coming up from Westland. In the process, Westland only built 18 Barracudas before the parts that they'd obviously constructed, and the incomplete jigs that they had were actually moved on to other manufacturers, and they went back to producing the Seafire, which was the aircraft carrier base version of the Supermarine Spitfire. Sorry, the Seafire, not the... So, the history versus the archaeology of the aircraft. Another factor we think in looking at it is, and what originally discounted the aircraft that we now believe it is, was that we did have a copy of the pilot's logbook, Sub-Lieutenant Sands, and handwritten in his logbook is a comment about a 2-mile swim. Looking back on this, and perhaps with a little bit of hindsight, one does wonder if that actually, his 2-mile swim doesn't refer to the direct line that his aircraft was from the beach, but actually how far he was swept up the Solent in the tides before he got ashore. Whatever way you look at it, if he did a 2-mile swim in January in the English Channel in 1944, which I believe is one of the coldest on record, he did very well to survive that swim. Sorry, jump forward. The other thing we've discovered in looking at the aircraft as it's recovered and as the parts have been taken to pieces and analysed is we have evidence of a fire in the cockpit. What you can see is fire damage to the tag's cockpit window, probably an electrical fire. The question is, and it's ongoing research, is whether this was a fire that had occurred before the aircraft hit the water, or whether it's in relation to a short circuit as the aircraft crashed and then was quickly smothered by the ingress of seawater and the aircraft sinking. A question we probably won't know the answer to. We have, or the Fleet Air Arm Museum have been in contact with Sub-Lieutenant Sands' family, and the hope is that further information, further diaries might be found amongst his personal effects. However, at this time, there's no evidence for that sort of material being around. So, what led us to the Barracuda partially in the first place? As the retained archaeologists during IFA2, what we were asked to do was identify things of archaeological value and shortlist these items in order for further research or to be dived on by the divers and recovered if they were considered of archaeological value, or to be redeposited outside of the cable route. What we had was 3 RATOG units, or rocket-assisted takeoff gear, and these were used from between about 1943, 1944, and up to the early 50s by the Fleet Air Arm. And the idea was that they would give an additional boost of power on an aircraft taking off that was heavily loaded, particularly either off short aircraft carriers. So this would be the escort carriers or the smaller carriers within the fleet, and also depending on their load. The designs that we'd come across, looking at, as you can see from the picture, were basically 2 5-inch rockets with a shoe at one end and Venturi nozzles at the other. These are electrically fired, and depending on the aircraft type, depended on how many of these rockets were fitted. In the case of the Fairey Barracuda and other Fairey designs, it would be 2 rockets on either side, each triggered electrically. They would fire for about 4 seconds and give about 1,100 pounds of boost each. You couldn't switch them off. They were basically just filled with cordite, and this is exactly the same rocket as was used to fire unguided ordnance. The way they were fitted was that they were clipped onto the side of the aircraft with a shoe that was bolted onto the aircraft, and then having been fired and the aircraft took off, basically you released another bungee cord holding them, and they would drop away from the aircraft. And the evidence we have of these is that the 3 lying off Daedalus would have been for people to carry out basically test flights and training flights on them. As I said before, Daedalus being significant in terms of its usage for both training flights for air crews, but also for testing of new equipment. No project would be complete without thanking all the people involved, and what I have to say is that we were very lucky in that National Grid IFA2 and the manager there, Jake Stevens, were happy to put archaeology to the fore on this project. A real privilege to work with them, and also in terms of the time and the cost on the archaeology, very lucky in terms of that, and very unique experience to have developers putting archaeology at the fore. Dave Morris, William Gibbs and Tony Jupe at Fleet Air Arm Museum, who helped us identify it and who are doing the ongoing work on it. James Fisher, who were the divers on the project, and Jenkins Marine, who operated the boat, and then of course my colleagues at Wessex, Ewan, Ben, Graham, Andrea, and many others who helped with the project, and our external diver, Mike. For those who are interested, there's a selected reference list. Some of them are not available at present, but hopefully in the near future they will start appearing in the grey literature and the HERs for anyone who might be interested. And of course there are some books on the background for the Fairey Barracuda. And it only leaves me to say, look forward to next week's talk with Suzanne Marie Taylor on the ML286, and any questions?